Um, Clarissa, thank you so much for doing this and having this conversation with me today. We'll be showing this at the award ceremony. But I'm going to ask you tough questions. That's what journalists are supposed to do. And I want to warn the audience that I actually do now have proof that you are, in fact, superhuman. Um, the reason we're doing this is because you are on the verge of having your third child.
That is correct. That is correct. And I really thank you for accommodating me because of the time difference and allowing us to pre-tape it a little earlier in the day. I wish so much I could be there in person or at least do it live, but yeah, my third boy is hopefully about to arrive in the coming days. So it's yeah, it's an exciting time. It's a little bit petrifying too.
Three boys. That
Three
is
boys.
terrifying. Given what you've covered. Well,
Yeah.
anyway, you know what I'm saying. And I will just say that I've got two daughters. Luckily, girls are better than boys. I'll say it. I can discuss this live with the audience. And I'll just say my wife and I were arguing about, the name of our first child. And
Yeah.
after I watched my wife give birth, I said, you know what, honey? You can choose the name.
You can choose. And that's what I always say to my husband as well. I'm like, the middle names, have at it. But unless you're going to do this whole childbirth thing, I think it's kind of my choice, the primary name.
Um, anyway, thank you again. So on a more sober note, I guess I want to talk to you about like this moment in journalism,
Mm,
what you see, in terms of covering wars, what you see, and I'll ask specific questions. Online harassment, particularly of women, and also what you see in terms of, I think authoritarian governments being more and more aggressive about cracking down mostly on local journalists. But
mhm.
I guess first of all, in terms of covering conflict, how have you seen that change given all the conflicts that you've covered? Um, is it more dangerous on the ground with each new conflict? I'm just curious about your thoughts, given
Yeah,
all.
I think it's definitely a grim moment right now. I mean, if we look at Ukraine, 17 journalists have been killed in the last 15 months there. And increasingly, it's clear that while we may not always be the target, there's certainly no effort spared to avoid killing journalists or to avoid killing humanitarians. We're seen as fair game. And that's something that actually predates Ukraine. We saw that a lot in Syria too, where actually journalists were actively targeted, kidnapped, killed. And so it is a grim landscape, but at the same time, I also feel like there have been some positive steps taken both by media organizations in terms of really trying to equip journalists who are traveling to conflict zones with all the latest information and all the latest kit and all the latest training that they need to have the best shot of telling the important stories, but telling them in a safe way. And I also feel like importantly, we're having more conversations about the impact and the toll that doing this kind of work can take. For such a long time, there was this very pervasive macho culture where people didn't really feel comfortable talking about PTSD. Talking about even maybe not full-blown PTSD, but just the stress of covering other people's trauma and of being subjected to a lot of misery and a lot of sadness and very, very high levels of stress. And I do think that as an industry, we have made great strides. We have more to make, but at kind of destigmatizing conversations around those topics and making it easier for people to get the help and support they need.
That's great, and that's great to hear. And you mentioned Syria. I'm actually on the James Foley Foundation board. James, as you know, was murdered along with Stephen Sotloff and several aid workers. Do you see? I'm just asking a blunt question, and again, and
Mm.
I just joined AMDC and was at the New Yorker, but there was a problem in Syria of sort of young. I mean, I was a staff writer for the Christian Science Monitor, but everyone, you can make your name covering conflict. So I didn't know if you see as many freelance journalists in Ukraine, and I mean, our news organizations, that sometime there was a wink, wink, like
Yeah.
make that dangerous trip and get that footage. And, but news organizations weren't really taking full responsibility when freelancers would go in. I wonder if you've seen any change in that dynamic.
I think I have. I think Syria was a real learning curve for media organizations who didn't want to take the responsibility of really looking after our freelance brothers and sisters, but were more than willing to buy their material when they did put themselves in impossibly dangerous situations, often without taking some pretty basic precautions that most of us would assume we would always take. And there was a sort of moral hazard created there for a while. Now, when we started to see journalists being killed, disappearing, being kidnapped, then I think very quickly news organizations understood that they did still bear responsibility in some small part or in some significant part for these young journalists. And so they did have an obligation to help try to find them, or whatever the case may be. It obviously changes a lot case by case. So now I think in Ukraine, which is similar in the sense that it is a war zone that is relatively easy to gain access to, which is different than Iraq and Afghanistan, which we both covered in the years before, where it was much more difficult. You kind of had to go through the US military to gain access to anything or to move around. Ukraine, obviously, you buy a ticket to Poland and then get on a train or drive or whatever, and you can pretty easily gain access to that conflict zone. But I think we see a much more responsible attitude being taken by the vast majority of media organizations, which isn't to say they won't hire freelancers. And by the way, they should hire freelancers and give them work, and that's important and that's great. But they will hold them to a certain standard, and they will make sure that they have the appropriate insurance, that they have the appropriate training in terms of going to hostile environments, courses, et cetera. And again, I think that's encouraging. I think that also needs to be extended to local journalists. There are some organizations that are better about that than others, because frankly, when we're really talking about the risks and who bears the brunt of the danger and the threats, and whether that's military violence or whether that's the threat of arrest or detention, it is local journalists who are facing the greatest risks on the ground, and who do not often have the support of organizations like CNN or like NBC News.
No, absolutely. I mean, the same expression that all foreign, you're only as good a foreign correspondent as the local journalist who's working with you, was always my view. And is
100%.
Incredibly brave Afghan and Iraqi journalists, and for me, Bosnian journalists before that. And one follow-up, I mean, I don't, there's people in the audience now, or maybe people who will see this online, but it sounds like you also, but I think there are freelancers who are afraid to ask these questions of editors. But I think it's good. And maybe this is too idealistic, but I would encourage them to ask editors questions about, what happens if something goes wrong. Because if something does go wrong, then, the freelancer in a way will be sort of blamed for it. And I think any good editor, and again, I might be too idealistic here, I'm impressed when a freelancer asks me that question. Well,
Absolutely.
what are the terms of this assignment? How long is it for? The pay. What happens if something goes wrong? And I think it's a good thing when a young journalist asks those questions.
I think it's an incredibly good thing. And by the way, I would even say that not only for freelancers, I think a lot of time young staffers as well walk into this situation. They assume because other people have been doing it that it's all just going to magically kind of unfold in this way. They don't have a proper reverence for what the risks really are. And again, whether it's talking to that editor and getting a better sense of how does this all work, and what does it mean that I have insurance, and how does that relate to X, Y, or Z, and what should I be telling my parents, and how should I have communications, and how should I be monitoring my communications, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a second as well, which is hugely important. Then there's also another recommendation I make is reach out to me. If you work at CNN or frankly, wherever you work, find a mentor, find someone in the industry who has been covering conflict for longer than you have, who can share their wisdom and share their experience. Because at the end of the day, you can't just bone up for this stuff by reading a lot or reading about the conflict itself. You have to talk to people who have been doing it for a long time, who really can help share small tips that can make a big difference.
Yes, there are no dumb questions in war zones. And I just agree with
Absolutely.
you that we can all, compete like hell regarding the story, but there's a way to share safety information between news organizations and reporters
Definitely.
that help tremendously. So you mentioned communications.
Mhm.
I totally agree that local journalists face by far the biggest risks and get the biggest punishments. But so today, we have Pegasus, another software, that can infect our cell phones. We don't even know it's there. So I'm just curious, when you mentioned securing communications, I mean, are there effective steps that can be taken? What do you try to do to
You know,
protect?
I think it's a little tricky because the problem is if you take too many steps to be too effective, then sometimes that can look like tradecraft to security agencies around the world. And so I remember someone recommending to me, because when I was going to Russia to do the story of Alexei Navalny's poisoning, and we had worked with Bellingcat to find this FSB team of toxins experts who were involved in the poisoning. And someone recommended maybe you should take a sort of a blank cell phone, basically, right? Like, don't take your own cell, take one that is completely clean and has nothing on it. And then I spoke to another Russian friend before I went, and they were like, definitely do not take a clean cell phone with you, because that doesn't look like normal journalistic behavior traditionally. That looks like you're a spy or you have something to hide. And so in the end, I took my own cell phone, but I'm very mindful about how I use my cell phone, when I will put it into airplane mode versus allowing it to get signal and ping on various cell phone towers. I'm mindful of when I will use Signal as opposed to regular text messaging, or even WhatsApp, which has encryption, but it's not as secure as Signal, versus Telegram. I mean, there's a sort of plethora of considerations that you take about which messaging app to use at which moment, and how often to be routinely deleting messages or disappearing messages. And at the end of the day, I think what you have to understand, it's not a perfect science, right? There isn't a way to do it with complete discretion. And the fact that Pegasus exists, and again, as we've mentioned several times now, it's local journalists in countries like Mexico and other places, Uzbekistan, who are being targeted most often with Pegasus software. But the nature of Pegasus software is that you can use whatever secure app and encryption you want, and it's not going to make any difference, because basically somebody has a window into your phone and can see whatever you're talking about and with whomever. So then you have to just start thinking about whether you would say something on your phone that you wouldn't want anyone to hear you saying publicly, whether you would want to give away information that, and believe me, for someone like me, that's hard, because I tend to be like a chatty Cathy, and I just want to like talk and share all kinds of information. And I think we just have to recognize that these wonderful gadgets that have made our lives easier in many ways have also made us much more vulnerable in many ways. And more importantly, have made our sources and the local journalists that we work with incredibly vulnerable. And I'm sure many of us have had situations, as I have, where you'll be talking to someone and then they'll go dark. And I don't push, I don't press. I wait for them to come back to me. And often they do 6 months later. And sure enough, someone stole my phone. I had to make up a story about why I was talking to you or who you were. And so we just need to be mindful, and we need to be sensitive, and we need to understand that it's dangerous anywhere in the world, but particularly if you're traveling in one of these kind of authoritarian police states, you really need to be incredibly diligent about maintaining good habits in terms of your computer and your cell phone.
That's the great and very simple advice of don't name the source. I just
Yes,
don't even
exactly.
communicate it's very
Yeah,
good. And I think that's true anywhere, whether it's
definitely.
Uzbekistan or New
Definitely.
York City in this age, because there'll be private, eyes that are surveilling, I think, journalists and trying to find out information. Um, Two more. One sort of related question. You talked about the kind of this moment, this digital moment, or the double-edged sword of technology. Um, I just want to, and we don't have to talk about this too much, but I do think, and studies have shown that female journalists are harassed far more online. You talked about PTSD. It's out, it's just deeply frustrating. Again, the what people will dare say online, which they would never say in person. But I
Mm.
just don't know if you have any thoughts for younger female reporters about how to deal with this and
I
how to not
do, because it's
discourage.
really hard. I remember the first time, it was really when I started covering Syria a lot in 2012, so more than 10 years ago. And obviously I was younger, but I attracted the attention of a lot of trolls. And a lot of it was focused on my appearance, how skinny I was, how I looked like a horse, how I should be shot in the head 3 times and fed to pigs. I mean, it really ran the gamut. And at that stage, I wasn't used to it. It was a relatively new phenomenon, and it was horrifying, honestly, very frightening, very shocking. And even though your sensible mind says, obviously, this is nonsense and these are trolls and don't listen to it, a part of you is hurt and is sort of looking at yourself like, do I look terrible? Am I, hideous? Am I so hateful in some way that I'm worthy of all this horrible criticism and nastiness? And the only thing I can say to young female journalists, particularly, although I think all of us are impacted by it, is you have to tune all of it out. It is not real, it is noise. And I also tell people to tune out a lot of the praise. And that sounds crazy because praise is so nice, it makes us feel so good. But all of it is a distraction. All of it takes us to a place where we are in our own echo chambers, where we are very focused on our own role within a story and how a story makes us look. And all of it's a distraction. We need to be focusing on the work. We can't be consumed by this noise, which not only is hurtful and ugly often, but also is it's taking our attention away from where it needs to be. And frankly, I would say one of the best things, I mean, many people will disagree, that Elon Musk has done at Twitter is, because this blue tick thing now, so many people don't even have blue ticks anymore. So I don't even read the comments, because even if I went and clicked on the verified ones, no one who has a blue tick is actually an old blue tick person. And everyone like me who had a blue tick no longer has one anymore. And so it's just a cacophony of noise and chaos that I wouldn't even attempt to sift through. And I am a better journalist for it, because it means instead of worrying about whether I said the right thing or the wrong thing or gave a good impression or whatever it might be, I'm really laser focused on telling the stories that I'm working on telling. And we should all be more concerned, honestly, with how people whose stories we're telling feel about the job that we do. They're not always going to love us for it, and often we're going to be critical and we're going to hold feet to the fire, but hopefully at least they'll say that we're fair. And so yes, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Yes, it's ugly, but we really, in this environment with all the challenges that we're facing in terms of misinformation and people turning away from mainstream media, I think we don't have too much time to cry about it. We just have to tune it out and get on with the job at hand.
Again, great. I mean, just get out and on the ground reporting, face to face, reporting with people that, and then you have more to say on TV. You need that information and that knowledge to really deliver great journalism, in whatever format. And then just lastly, you mentioned, people turning away from mainstream journalism, there's authoritarian governments around the world. I've just wonder, President Biden, and we need to be very tough on the Biden administration as well, but talks about, this moment, this competition now between democracies and autocracies. So I just want to ask you, in terms of press freedom, CBJ, a record number of journalists jailed around the world. How do you feel the press is doing, the free and independent press, versus all these efforts to silence
Uh,
journalists around the world?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a grim state of affairs. It's something like, I believe the statistic I just heard recently was like 30% of countries now have some form of a free press, which is far from ideal. You know, we have a lot of work to do. We have a long way to go. In many ways, we've been losing that battle because there has been a sense that authoritarian regimes have been acting with impunity, and there is a limit to what all the best intentioned journalists all over the world can do, even as much as they want to draw attention and rally support for their friends and colleagues who may have been detained or worse. You know, if an authoritarian regime makes the calculation that that is something they're comfortable with doing, it's very difficult for anybody to stop it. My fear as well, and I don't want to end on a doom and gloom note, but I think there will be a lot of challenges that will come with the rise of AI.
Mhm.
There will be a huge amount of opportunities as well in the long run, but man, misinformation, and it's going to get a little scary and probably very ugly for a while. And we are all going to have to collectively come together and grapple with how we move through this moment. I think at the end of it, we're going to come out stronger because people will really begin to understand the importance of choosing truth in all of this, and the importance of acknowledging the existence of a shared truth in any given society, even though, of course, we have 100 different ways of perceiving things, and we're all products of biases based on our upbringing and our education. But the idea that we adhere to certain journalistic ethics, and that we believe in this idea of the concept of truth, is so crucially important. So I think it's dark days at the moment, and it might get a little darker before it gets lighter, but that's why we're all here. That's why we all do this job. That's why we risk our lives often to do it, and why we care about it so much, and why we feel so proud to be able to do it.
That is a perfect note to end this interview and to start giving out awards here. But thank you. You have gone out and risked your life over and over again to get ground truth, to go into these places. And I'm delighted that you joined us. I'm thrilled to speak with you. And, most of all, good luck with that third boy.
And so have you, David. I mean, you have been everywhere and gone through it all. And thank you for this conversation. And congratulations to all the winners tonight. I'm so thrilled for you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Clarissa, so much.